dive a little bit further with even more definitions and semantics around classical conditioning. One of the big ones we're going to talk about is acquisition. And acquisition is a pretty straightforward concept. This is the idea that you have acquired conditioning. I was previously talking about conditioning pairings or conditioning trials. Most of the time in behaviorism, we refer to this as an acquisition trial. Anytime the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus are paired together, those two antecedents are paired together, this is called an acquisition trial. And that's because we're mapping them together to show that they go together. So in the example of the dog, it's the idea every time we pair the bell and the meat together, that is an acquisition trial. Every time someone feels a sting and sees a wasp, that is an acquisition trial. And every time, let's say you looked at your watch, your phone rang, be unusual, but let's say every time you glanced at a watch, your phone would ring, that would be an acquisition trial, pairing the visual of your watch and your phone ringing. And so this is how we create a conditioned response. This is how we create a conditioning. And so once you have paired this, and remember, this is often an involuntary reflex. You often aren't even aware that this has been paired. It's unconscious. But once this is paired, it's considered that you have reached acquisition. Once your brain has correlated these two things, you have reached acquisition for that conditioning. So acquisition is the idea that you have obtained conditioning. So once you start to have a response to a wasp, that's acquisition. Once you drool to a bell, that's acquisition. And when you start looking at your watch and you're ready to answer your phone at the same time, it would be unusual, but that would be acquisition. Now, the opposite of acquisition is extinction. And this is when a conditioning starts to weaken or even goes away entirely. And so extinction is the idea that the two stimuli are unpaired. And so we can have extinction trials, much like we can have acquisition trials in which the unconditioned stimuli and the neutral stimuli are paired. We can have an extinction stimuli when we are only showing the neutral stimuli or we're only showing the conditioned stimuli. So once the dogs were actually trained to drool to the bell, it was possible for Pavlov to just ring the bell over and over again and not present meat. And eventually they stopped drooling to the bell alone. It went away. And so this is really important for us to understand because this is a major mechanism of how we can treat things like phobias. Let's say someone is very, very, very scared of a wasp now that they've been stung once, and we want to help them get over that because there's lots of wasps in the world. Well, we could make it so they are around wasps but don't get stung. And we could do that through various safety gear or different situations where they are seeing maybe virtual wasps or maybe through virtual reality or something else. And it's the idea that they're around wasps, but no pain can come to them. And none of those really negative psychic reflexes can happen. They're going to feel the fear. They're going to have that conditioned response initially. But once we present the conditioned stimuli enough without the unconditioned stimuli, the conditioned response, the fear and panic, will weaken over time. Much like the dogs will eventually stop drooling to the bell, we'll stop having that huge fear response to wasps. This works really well with a large variety of different phobias. And so every extinction trial is when you're just presenting the conditioned stimuli or the neutral stimuli, and it doesn't have any of the unconditioned stimuli there, so you're not getting the unconditioned response. Without that large unconditioned response, eventually it's going to extinguish and weaken the conditioning. Now, unfortunately, there is this thing called spontaneous recovery. And what we find in a lot of phobia treatment is even if we do enough extinction trials that the fear response goes away, sometimes the next day or the next week or the next month, all of a sudden somebody will have a huge fear response to their conditioned stimulus again, even though there's no unconditioned stimulus. So what I'm saying is, even if we train someone to not be afraid of wasps or not be afraid of fire or not be afraid of snakes or spiders, and they have no response on day one, they go home, have a good night's sleep, and day two they come back in the lab, and the first time they see a spider or a wasp or snakes, they have a huge fear response again. What's causing that? Well, it's just a little bit of memory in our nervous system trying to prepare us, trying to keep us safe. And luckily, when they have this, it's going to be a weaker response than they did initially. So every time they have spontaneous recovery, let's say on a scale from 1 to 100, they start off with a fear of wasps at 100, and we get it down to 0 on day 1. They go back in the lab on day 2, and they have a fear response of about an 80. We can train that again with enough extinction trials in the lab on day 2 to get it down to 0 again. But the next day they might come back in and now their fear response is a 60. we can get that down to 0 again. And it might come back a month later and it might only be a 40. We can train that back down to 0 again. So spontaneous recovery is the idea that some of these phobias, some of these acquisitions can come back without any future training, but we can get rid of them again with additional extinction trials. So acquisition and extinction, you can think of those kind of a go button and a stop button, or a pairing button and an unpairing button, if you will. But there's even more to consider when we think about classical conditioning. There's also the notion of generalization. Now, we talked about generalizability in our Unit 2 research methods, about whether your sample generalized to the other population. This is sort of similar, but different. So generalization in learning and behavioral psychology refers to the fact that you may start to respond to other neutral stimuli that were not the original neutral stimuli, but that has some similarities. This is the idea that although the dogs might begin to drool to a very classic tinny bell, they might also start to drool to steel bells or other alarm bells, or even other types of chimes or instruments that make the other types of very ringing sounds. This is the idea that although you were conditioned to respond to a wasp, you may also find yourself responding to other insects that fly and that buzz, like bees or mosquitoes or dragonflies, or just rather regular houseflies that buzz. And this is the idea that although your phone only rings when you look at your watch, you might start reaching for your phone or getting ready to answer your phone when you see any type of clock or hear any other type of clock ticking. And so this is the idea that although these were not in the original pairing and were never paired, they have so much similarity to your conditioned stimuli that you are getting a conditioned response by being associated with them. So when you see these other things or hear these other things, you are getting a conditioned response. It's likely this conditioned response might be very similar or might be even weaker than the other conditioned response. Now, the opposite of generalization is discrimination. This does not mean racial discrimination or marginalization or anything with regards to social psychology. Instead, in behavioral psychology, discrimination has its own definition. And this is the idea that you don't respond to neutral stimuli that are dissimilar from your conditioned stimuli. Now, even though you may be conditioned to drool to the sound of a certain type of bell, if you hear a buzzer or a deeper alarm that is dissimilar from the original bell, you're not going to drool. Now, even though you've been conditioned to have a fear response to a black and yellow wasp, you may not have any response to a black and yellow butterfly. It's not something you're going to fear. And so it's the idea that there's going to be some types of insects, some types of bells, and some types of timekeepers that you're not going to pair and you're not going to match because they are so dissimilar from your conditioned stimuli that you're not making the connection. So acquisition, extinction, generalization, and discrimination are sort of the 4 pillars that hold up these paradigms of classical conditioning and help us to understand how classical conditioning works. That being said, we could always make this more complicated, and so one brief example of a more complicated classically conditioned paradigm is what we call higher order conditioning. And this is when you pair the first conditioned stimuli, conditioned stimulus 1, with an additional neutral stimuli that may be very different, but because the conditioned stimuli is now paired with this additional neutral stimuli, the neutral stimuli, or neutral stimuli 2, becomes conditioned stimuli 2. I'll explain this. So if we think about Pavlov's dog, and we think about how they started to listen to, let's say, the door opening up. And when the door opened up by the research assistants, and they knew that meat was coming into the lab, they would start to drool to just the sound of the door opening. But then they started to realize the door was paired with another sound. They could hear the footsteps. So this is the idea that the meat was the original unconditioned stimuli, the door opening was the original neutral stimuli, or neutral stimuli 1, which became conditioned stimuli 1, and the door opening got paired with the footsteps. And the footsteps were neutral stimuli 2, paired with the door opening, they become conditioned stimuli 2. And so this is the idea that they started to not just respond to the door opening, but now dogs would drool to just the footsteps. Footsteps are totally different than meat, totally different than the door opening, but they saw the correlations, they saw the connections, and their body had that reflex. If we go to our wasp example, let's say that the wasp stung you when you were out around your barn in the morning. And so this is the idea that the wasp didn't sting you in your house, it didn't sting you on your patio, it stung you when you were around your barn. And so this is the idea that the painful sting is the unconditioned stimulus. It's mapped with the visual of a wasp, which becomes a conditioned stimulus with a fear response, but you only ever see wasps next to your barn. The burn is neutral stimulus too, and eventually when you see lots of wasps around your barn on a frequent basis, now you're going to get a fear response just when you go near your barn. You don't need to see a wasp when you're at your barn, and you don't need to get stung. Just seeing your barn and having to go to your barn in the early mornings is enough to make your heart race and enough to make your body have that psychic reflex. And let's say the whole watch and phone ringing thing, it only worked when you were looking at the sunrise or when you were driving home at the sunset. It was a certain type of day. Now what you might find is, although phone ringing makes you jump for your phone, and that's mapped with looking at a watch, and the watch becomes a conditioned stimuli, but you tend to find out that you're looking at your watch near the end of the day when you're tired, and now when you're at the end of the day and you're tired, you think about looking at your watch and you think about touching your phone. That example is still a little bit different, and I'm keeping that in there for a reason, because you might have picked up that, well, why does ringing your phone cause a psychic reflex? That's something we would have had to learn. Exactly. So sometimes we can find that our lives are so complicated that by the time we're a few years old and we're beyond infancy, there's so many things we react to that something that otherwise originally would have been a neutral stimuli can be used as an unconditioned stimuli in these really complicated paths. So by the time you are an adult, there's so many things you respond to in your environment that really trying to pick apart a clean example of this can be really challenging. But this is the basics of it.